The courtroom held its breath as the doors swung open. All rose, not just for the judge, but in disbelief. Denzel Washington, the legendary actor, walked in not as a witness, not as a defendant, but as a self-representing attorney. Judge Amy Coney Barrett raised an eyebrow. To her, this was a publicity stunt. But what began as a spectacle soon spiraled into a legal storm that neither the court nor the country would forget. Denzel Washington, famous for his commanding screen presence, had recently taken a personal interest in a high-profile wrongful conviction case involving his close friend, a decorated veteran accused of insider trading and national betrayal. Against all advice, Denzel studied the law relentlessly and filed a petition to defend him pro se. The case was assigned to none other than Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, presiding in a special tribunal. With cameras banned, transcripts sealed, and the stakes unimaginably high, this was not about fame. It was about truth. What followed was a legal duel charged with ego, secrets, and brilliance. The hush in the courtroom was unnatural. The kind of silence that came not from respect, but from disbelief. When Denzel Washington stepped forward in a fitted Navy suit, briefcase in hand, it was as though the courtroom itself didn't know how to react. He wasn't here as an actor or celebrity. He wasn't making a statement. He was here to try a case. And Judge Amy Coney Barrett didn't hide her disapproval. From her high perch, framed by the weight of the Constitution etched behind her, she watched him with a studied stillness. As the murmurs faded, her gavel struck once. "Mr. Washington," she said, the words clipped and measured. "This is a federal tribunal, not a film set. I will not tolerate theatrics or grandstanding. Are you prepared to proceed as legal counsel?" Denzel's reply was calm, but deliberate. "Yes, Your Honor. I have studied this case for 11 months. I've passed the necessary bar requirements for temporary representation under Federal Statute 28 U.S.C. Section 1654. I am prepared to speak not as a performer, but as a defender of the truth." Barrett raised an eyebrow, just slightly. It was the only tell. Then she turned to the clerk. "Let the record reflect Mr. Washington is representing the defendant, Mr. James R. Lantham, under pro se provisions with special authorization. We proceed." And just like that, the courtroom war began. The prosecution team, headed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Colleen Dorsey, wasted no time. They launched into a polished opening statement, highly rehearsed, full of damning evidence, and designed to humiliate Denzel's friend, a decorated Marine turned financial analyst, now accused of leaking classified trade data in exchange for stock manipulation profits. The prosecution painted Lantham as a traitor cloaked in medals. It was a devastating picture. Then it was Denzel's turn. He stood slowly, no notes in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, pacing with the discipline of a seasoned orator. "In every story, there's a villain. But not every accusation is truth. Not every decorated soldier turned analyst is a traitor. And not every prosecutor is interested in justice. Today, we'll learn what really happened, and why this man's only crime was knowing too much." Judge Barrett didn't flinch, but her knuckles tightened around the gavel. "Stick to the law, Mr. Washington. This is not a stage for drama." Denzel nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. But the truth sometimes is dramatic, especially when it's been buried." The first half hour of proceedings was a pressure cooker. Barrett challenged every motion Denzel made. She denied 3 early objections. At one point, she paused to clarify the federal rule he was referencing, subtly suggesting he might not know it well enough. But each time, Denzel responded with precision, sometimes even quoting the rule verbatim, noting precedents and subclauses with surprising fluency. What was expected to be a celebrity sideshow was quickly turning into something else, a legitimate contest of legal minds. The audience, court officials, legal analysts, Even a few hidden reporters posing as law clerks began whispering. Denzel's command of the federal rules of evidence was undeniable. What was more unnerving to Barrett, perhaps, was his unshakable calm. He wasn't just performing, he was convincing. The first major confrontation came during cross-examination. The prosecution's key witness, a cybersecurity consultant named Evan Hargrove, testified that Latham had accessed restricted files from a Department of Defense server. The logs, he claimed, were unalterable. But Denzel was ready. "You say the access logs can't be forged," he began slowly. "Can you confirm whether those logs pass through a third-party diagnostic software?" Hargrove blinked. Yes. The logs are backed up through Simon-SEC, a contractor for the agency." "And who audits Simon-SEC?" Denzel pressed. "How often? And do you personally verify their data integrity?" Hargrove hesitated. "That's not my responsibility." Denzel smiled faintly. "So, we're basing this man's betrayal on access logs you haven't verified, from a system you don't control, audited by a private firm under a no-bid government contract?" "Objection!" the prosecutor barked. Judge Barrett narrowed her eyes. "Overruled. Answer the question." It was subtle, but clear. The judge was no longer brushing him off. The rest of the day unfolded with equal tension. Barrett challenged Denzel's every move, but beneath the surface, her own stance was evolving. She began leaning in when he spoke. She no longer cut him off mid-question. Once, when Denzel stumbled over a legal citation, she actually paused the court, asked him to find it in the Federal Digest, and waited patiently while he flipped pages. The moment was small, but seismic. The courtroom knew. Respect was being earned, not given. By the time the first recess was called, no one in the room saw Denzel Washington as a movie star anymore. Not even Judge Barrett. He wasn't trying to win with charm. He was fighting with knowledge. And knowledge, even in the courtroom of one of the most powerful judges in the country, was beginning to make her nervous. The second day of trial began with storm clouds outside the courthouse, a fitting omen for what was about to unravel within. Inside the courtroom, Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat with the same cool composure, but her fingers drummed slightly against her bench, a rhythm too subtle for most to notice. Denzel Washington, however, noticed everything. He walked in without ceremony, carrying only a single manila folder. There was no entourage, no camera crews. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to reveal something no one else had seen. Once the proceedings resumed, Denzel requested permission to introduce a new piece of evidence, a document the government had submitted but had not analyzed in full. A Department of Defense training manual for cryptographic operations used by elite intelligence teams. Most considered it irrelevant. It had been glossed over, skimmed by paralegals, and logged in the discovery process, but it had not been examined in detail. Denzel turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request the court's attention to Exhibit 48C, the Field Cryptography Manual from June 2009. Specifically, I direct your attention to page 217, subsection 4, paragraph 3. Barrett narrowed her eyes. That page was missing from the original submission. Denzel gave a small nod. Exactly. I had to file a separate Freedom of Information Act request to obtain the missing pages. What I found, Your Honor, may change the direction of this trial entirely. There was a hum of tension in the room. Barrett gave a slow nod. Proceed. Denzel handed a copy of the recovered page to the clerk, who distributed it to the judge and the prosecution. On it was a protocol known as Project Cascade. At first glance, it was dense military jargon, but Denzel had spent months decoding its meaning, with the help of retired intelligence officers and technical experts. Project Cascade, he began, was a classified protocol for embedding false leaked data into encrypted servers, used as bait to identify internal threats. The idea was to make the data look sensitive, make it trackable, and wait to see who accessed or moved it. He turned to the jury. My client, James Lantham, was a clearance-level analyst assigned to audit Project Cascade. What the prosecution calls unauthorized access was in fact part of his audit responsibilities. What they label a breach was an intentional government trap. And now that the trap was sprung, and no real mole caught, they've chosen to pin it on the one man who understood it. Judge Barrett was silent, reading the page. Why was this protocol not submitted in full to the court? The prosecutor, visibly caught off guard, replied, "Your Honor, this document was redacted by the Department of Defense. We had no control over the missing page." Denzel wasn't done. Let the record show that the prosecution built its entire case on digital footprints and security breaches, without ever disclosing that the system in question was intentionally compromised by its own architects. And more importantly, that my client had permission to interact with that data. The air in the room had changed. Barrett leaned forward now, gripping the document, reading the footnotes again. "And you obtained this page how?" "I filed a FOIA request under the legal name of a former enlisted officer who had clearance to reference that era's protocol manuals," Denzel said. That officer provided a signed affidavit verifying the document's authenticity. The file was declassified 2 weeks before this trial began. The prosecution moved to strike the evidence on grounds of procedure. But Barrett, after a long pause, overruled the objection. "The court will admit this page, and I recommend the prosecution reconsider the foundation of their digital evidence moving forward." A gasp rippled quietly through the courtroom. Barrett's voice was calm, but the message was loud. The core of the government's case had been shaken. What made the moment more powerful was how quietly it had happened. No grand speech, no soaring music, just a missing page, a single piece of paper forgotten in the mountain of classified files, now transformed into a sledgehammer. And Denzel wasn't finished. He then cross-examined the lead cyberforensics expert, forcing him to admit that he was unaware of Project Cascade's existence. "So," Denzel said slowly, "your entire testimony was based on logs from a server intentionally seeded with false data, and you never knew." The witness shifted uncomfortably. "That would significantly alter my conclusions." Barrett's tone was steel. "It does." What had started as a grandstanding accusation against a Hollywood actor playing at law had become something else entirely. Judge Barrett now found herself looking not at a man performing a role, but at someone who had unearthed something everyone else, herself included, had missed. The courtroom recessed for the day with a strange silence. There was no applause, no celebration, just a dawning realization. The truth had always been there, hidden beneath red tape and arrogance, waiting for someone determined enough to find it. And Judge Barrett, for the first time in her storied career, realized she might be on the wrong side of a truth she didn't see coming. By the third day of the trial, the courtroom was no longer simply watching Denzel Washington. It was listening to him. The air was different now. Respect, once withheld, now followed every word he spoke. But with respect came resistance. The prosecution was unraveling, and with that unraveling came panic. A panic Judge Amy Coney Barrett could no longer ignore. Assistant U.S. Attorney Colleen Dorsey opened the day with an aggressive tone, a clear departure from her earlier confident stride. Her voice cracked slightly during her morning objections. Her strategy had shifted. No longer on the offensive, she was plugging holes. Legal leaks sprung by Denzel's precise cross-examinations and newly introduced evidence. But the more she tried to recover, the more it seemed she was reacting to Denzel's moves rather than making her own. That morning, Denzel requested the court revisit a chain of internal emails between officials at SEC, the private cybersecurity contractor whose logs had been used to build the government's digital case. These emails had been submitted into discovery, but had been dismissed as routine interdepartmental chatter. Your Honor, Denzel said calmly, I believe the emails dated May 3rd, 2020, at 11:37 p.m. and 11:42 p.m. contained deliberate language suggesting the data logs used to track my client were manually altered, and that SEC knew about it. Judge Barrett adjusted her glasses. Manually altered? That's a serious accusation. It is, Denzel replied. But the language used, especially in this line, scrub the trailing digits and timestamp alignment so it matches DoD standard formatting, suggests a deliberate action that affected the metadata attached to the files allegedly accessed by Mr. Latham. Dorsey objected, citing lack of technical qualifications. But Denzel was prepared. Your Honor, I have brought in Dr. Min Alvarez, a former NSA encryption specialist and current professor at MIT. Dr. Alvarez has reviewed the data and is willing to testify to what those log modifications mean. In plain English, Judge Barrett hesitated. This wasn't a man guessing. This was a man working his case like a seasoned litigator. She permitted the witness. Dr. Alvarez testified with firm clarity. The phrase Mr. Washington referenced is not routine maintenance language. It refers to the manual shifting of digital fingerprints, essentially erasing a user's trail and pasting it elsewhere. In my professional opinion, the logs were doctored to implicate Mr. Latham. Silence, then murmurs. Judge Barrett asked only one question. Would someone with access to these logs be able to frame another user? Alvarez nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Easily. Prosecutor Dorsey was visibly sweating now. She asked for a recess. Denied. Barrett leaned forward slightly. You may proceed, Mr. Washington. Denzel turned next to the prosecution's star witness, a Department of Defense liaison who had testified on day one that Latham had no current clearance at the time of the alleged breach. What Denzel revealed next would land like a grenade in the courtroom. He produced a personnel access sheet, time-stamped 3 days after the alleged breach, confirming that Latham's clearance had not been suspended until later. I'd like the court to note, Denzel said, pacing slowly, that this document proves Mr. Latham's clearance was valid during the time in question. The claim that he had no authority is not only false, it's knowingly false. The witness stuttered. That document, that wasn't in my briefing. Because it was withheld, Denzel snapped. Not by mistake, but because it blows a hole through the center of your testimony. Barrett's face remained neutral, but her eyes flicked from Denzel to Dorsey. Counsel, why was this document not included in the prosecution's exhibit list? Dorsey fumbled. We believed it to be immaterial, Your Honor. Your belief, Barrett said coldly, does not supersede this court's right to examine all relevant evidence. This wasn't just a courtroom drama anymore. It was turning into something far more dangerous. A public dissection of bureaucratic malpractice. The whispers were louder now, growing into low murmurs even among court clerks. Barrett called for order. It was becoming clear. The case had been built on assumptions, supported by filtered evidence, and shepherded by an overconfident prosecution. And now, thanks to Denzel's methodical dismantling, those pillars were falling fast. But the most striking transformation was in Judge Barrett herself. On day one, she had treated Denzel like a distraction, a novelty. Now, she rarely interrupted him. She listened, sometimes with a hand to her mouth, brow furrowed not in disdain but concern. It wasn't just about Latham anymore. It was about the system. She'd been a part of it for so long. She hadn't realized how easily it could be manipulated. During a short recess that afternoon, Judge Barrett remained at her bench while the rest of the court cleared. Her pen hovered over her notepad, unmoving. She was no longer certain, and that, for a Supreme Court justice, was a terrifying place to be. When court resumed, Denzel made no victory gestures. He simply continued, calm and prepared, peeling away layer after layer of a case that had once seemed impenetrable. And with every page turned, every false claim exposed, Judge Barrett felt the weight of her gavel grow heavier in her hand. The government's case wasn't just bleeding, it was hemorrhaging. By the fourth day, the courtroom no longer felt like a government institution. It felt like a crucible. Every person present, from the jury to the stenographer, seemed to sense that something historic was unfolding. Denzel Washington, a man once underestimated and mocked for defending his friend, was now not only holding his own, but challenging the integrity of a case built by the federal government itself. But as the day began, it was clear the pressure was mounting, and not just for the prosecution. Denzel looked tired, not physically. His posture was straight, his tie still perfectly knotted. But there was a heaviness in his eyes. He had carried this case on his back for nearly a year. Sleepless nights poring over legal codes, endless interviews with reluctant whistleblowers, the public ridicule of being an actor playing lawyer. Now, the end was in sight, but the emotional toll was beginning to show. And then it happened. James Latham, the man he had come here to defend, the man who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and was now being accused of betraying his country, collapsed in the witness box during cross-examination. He had just been forced to listen to a government audio recording in which officials joked about his inevitable conviction. Denzel had objected, but Judge Barrett had reluctantly allowed it as admissible. The moment the laughter played, Latham's face went pale. He clutched his chest and slumped forward. Gasps filled the courtroom. Medics rushed in. Denzel stepped back, giving them room, but his hands shook. His eyes remained locked on his friend, a man who had survived war, only to be broken by the system he served. After 10 tense minutes, Latham was stabilized and taken out on a stretcher. The judge ordered a temporary recess, but Denzel did not leave the courtroom. He stood alone at the defense table, motionless. His hand hovered over his notes, but didn't touch them. And then, in a moment so silent it seemed to mute time itself, he looked up at Judge Barrett, and she looked back. Something unspoken passed between them. When court resumed an hour later, Denzel rose without being prompted. There were no dramatic motions, no legal theatrics, just one man, speaking from a place deeper than argument, from pain. "I had planned to give you 10 minutes of technical rebuttals," he began, his voice low. "I had charts. I had data. I had timelines." He looked at the jury, then back at the bench. But today, Mr. Latham was broken by something more brutal than war. Not because he's guilty, but because he was forgotten. Forgotten by the government he served. Forgotten by the people who swore to protect him. Forgotten even by this courtroom. He took a breath. This is not a case about code breaches or encrypted servers. It's about what happens when we treat the truth as optional. When we assume that the accused is always wrong. When we think power equals justice. Judge Barrett shifted slightly. Her gaze didn't waver, but her fingers curled against her robes. Denzel placed one hand on the defense table. "You asked me, Your Honor, on the first day, if I was prepared to proceed. You looked at me and saw an actor. And maybe I am. But what I've acted in my entire life is truth. Even when it's painful. Even when the lines are written against me." He paused. "You have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimony. And you've seen the damage done when our system values conviction rates over conscience." A long silence followed. Then, softly, he said, "This is no longer about whether I win. It's about whether you can still see what justice looks like, when it's right in front of you." No one spoke. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment, transfixed. Judge Barrett stared down at her desk. Her pen tapped once, then stopped. The prosecution didn't even attempt a rebuttal. Dorsey simply nodded to the judge, declining to speak. Whether it was a tactical move or an admission of defeat was unclear. But no one missed the fear in her eyes. The jury recessed. The judge called for final review, but the real verdict had already begun to form. Not on paper, but in the conscience of every person in that room. As Denzel sat back down, he closed his eyes. He looked like a man who had run a marathon through fire, and now waited to see if the world would understand why he did it. For the first time in her career, Judge Amy Coney Barrett didn't see a defendant or an advocate before her. She saw a man who had bled for something more sacred than law. He had defended a brother, not just with facts, but with heart. And in that moment, she knew her verdict would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. The fifth day of the trial did not begin with objections or witnesses. It began with a silence so deep it almost hummed. The courtroom was full, yet motionless. No one whispered. No one coughed. Even the journalists in the gallery, those who usually typed furiously, seemed to hold their breath. Everyone was waiting for Judge Amy Coney Barrett. She entered the courtroom slowly, her robe trailing behind her like a shadow that had grown heavier with each passing day. Her eyes were distant, not unfocused, but turned inward, as if searching for something far below the surface of law, deeper than statute. For the first time in her long and decorated career, Barrett felt unsure. Not because she didn't know the law, but because she no longer trusted that the law had been properly applied. This trial had begun with certainty. The evidence had seemed clean. The government's case was thorough. And yet, one man, an actor no less, had unearthed the truth buried beneath polished lies and polished shoes. Now, that man sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded, no longer fighting. He had already said all he needed to say. It was no longer about performance. It was about whether anyone had truly listened. Judge Barrett glanced down at her notes. They were covered in red marks, notations, underlines, questions that no longer had easy answers. The prosecution rose first, offering a short, clinical summary of their position. Mr. Latham accessed classified data outside his operational jurisdiction. That is a fact. Regardless of intent, that action alone constitutes a violation of federal code. It was, by legal standards, sound, but it sounded hollow. Then Denzel rose. No theatrics, no rehearsed speech, just a calm presence and one question. Your Honor, are you willing to punish a man for walking into a trap? When the trap was designed by the very people accusing him, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the answer, whether they wanted to admit it or not. And then he sat down. Barrett stared at him for several seconds longer than protocol allowed. She wasn't just looking at him. She was studying the ripple he had caused in her court, in her certainty, in her very philosophy of justice. For hours, she remained in chambers, deliberating not just the case, but herself. She remembered how she'd initially smiled when she heard Denzel Washington would represent Latham. She recalled the private scoffs exchanged behind closed doors. "This will be over in a day," someone had said. But now, after 5 days, she was the one who had been transformed. Not by eloquence, not by performance, but by a truth laid bare under pressure. It wasn't Denzel's charisma that had swayed her. It was his unrelenting pursuit of facts, even when they cost him, even when they endangered his friend, even when they threatened to humiliate him. And now, it was time to face her own gavel. She returned to the courtroom slowly. As she sat, every person in the room rose in respect. But Barrett didn't acknowledge them. Her eyes were set on the defendant's chair, now empty, as Latham remained hospitalized. And then on Denzel, who met her gaze with quiet resolve. She tapped her gavel once. "I've spent the last several hours revisiting every piece of evidence presented during this trial. I've also reviewed the conduct of both the defense and the prosecution. What I've come to realize is this: justice does not always wear the robe of procedure, and sometimes the truth arrives wearing unfamiliar faces." She paused, Her voice did not tremble, but it softened. This court has long relied on systems, on reports, on experts. But today, it was forced to rely on something far more difficult: humility. She looked directly at Denzel. "Mr. Washington, when you first entered this courtroom, I saw you as a performer, a man unqualified to stand here. I was wrong. Not only did you meet the standards of this court, you exceeded them. You reminded us all what advocacy truly looks like. Not the manipulation of facts, but the defense of integrity." A long pause followed. Barrett closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them they glistened. "I hereby rule that all charges against Mr. James Latham are to be dismissed with prejudice. This court finds that the evidence used against him was tainted, incomplete, and in part, willfully manipulated." She raised the gavel again. "This case is dismissed." A thunderous silence followed. It was the kind of silence that happens when people witness something holy. A system correcting itself, however late, however reluctantly. Denzel did not smile. He simply looked down, exhaled, and placed one hand over the chair beside him, where Latham should have been. Judge Barrett stood. "Court is adjourned." She turned and walked out, not with the cold precision of a judge who had done her duty, but with the slow, heavy step of a woman who had been changed. And in her wake, a courtroom remained, not shaken by scandal, but renewed by truth.